Folks, my name is Don Lenehan. I am Senior Associate at Canada 2020 for Policy and Engagement. And it's I think my privilege and my very happy duty here this afternoon to introduce Cass Sunstein as the next speaker. But before I do, I want to say a couple of things about the book. There are many books and many works, and I'll say a little bit about that later. But you've all surely heard of Nudge, and I just want to take a moment to say something about it because I think it was such a remarkable achievement, and it's worthy of a few comments to get us started. So let me tell you a bit of a personal story. The book, I think, now is about 9 years old, and I can tell you the very moment when I first heard about it, I came home from work after a hard day at work and was having a nice glass of wine with my wife, and she said, "I heard this great interview this afternoon on CBC about this book, Nudge." And she said, "You've got to read it." So I dutifully ran out to Chapters and bought the book and went home and started reading it. I'm not making this up. By the time I got to page 15, it was one of those books where I said, this is an important book. It truly is. And I think there were three reasons I thought it was, and I think they've stood up very well. The first thing is conceptually, it's a very important book. It says something that we needed said very badly about the state of mainstream economics, about motivation, about psychology, about behavioral position in economics, about how we think about the way people relate to policy. And I think on that level alone, it was a really important piece of work and very clear. But secondly, it did what good books like that do. It went on to prescription. It told us some very fundamental things about what we need to do to change the way we think about policy. Those two things alone, I think, are enough to merit a very good book. But the third thing was the one that I think impressed me the most as a guy who goes back and forth from policy ideas to implementation and practicing. And that was that the book is enormously programmatic. It's chock full of very practical ideas and examples and illustrations of how you take these high-level ideas, these conceptual ideas and these principles, and you turn them into something new. You turn them into something practical. And I think the proof is in the pudding here. 9 years later, there's not a person in this room, there's probably not a person somewhere across this government or in most governments across the continent and around the world who don't see nudge as a part of their basic vocabulary now. And I think that really is a remarkable achievement. Of course, this is not Dr. Sunstein's only achievement, and I just want to say, first of all, he's an internationally renowned legal scholar specializing in constitutional law, administrative law, environmental law, and behavioral economics. From 2009 to 2012, he served under US President Barack Obama as his administrator of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. I learned just before this session that he actually was one of the founders who helped design the Open Government Partnership. For a person like myself, who is a big fan of open government, that's a great achievement. He was formerly a faculty member of the University of Chicago Law School and is currently Robert Walmsley University Professor at Harvard Law School. After his keynote, Dr. Sunstein will be interviewed by our own Paul Wells, yay, of the Toronto Star. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Cass Sunstein.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for not staying at lunch during this presentation. I actually have some breaking news for you. So you're going to see a bunch of slides, but this is completely new. For the past 8 months or so, I've been involved in trying to learn whether citizens of various nations are in favor of nudge-type interventions. And we're getting a kind of map about how people in liberal democracies, at least, think about these things. And the map basically shows that the citizens of most liberal democracies, and I have the data on the United States, the United Kingdom, Italy, France, and Germany. So let's take that as our quintet. They are in favor of the interventions I'm going to be describing, overwhelmingly. And the positive view is so strong that political disagreement basically doesn't matter. So in Germany, whatever party you are, chances are that something like a calorie label so that people can know whether the food they're eating has high caloric content, therefore a mandate to that effect. People do not like things that are deemed manipulative, and that's a very narrow category. If they suspect the government is doing something that is self-serving or is not in the interest of choosers, they're opposed to that. But otherwise, there is a strong democratic consensus in their favor. Mandates, by the way, stand on a much weaker ground. People are more skeptical about mandates, even if they approve of the goal. Now, what I'm here to tell you is that there are two nations, Hungary and Denmark, which are more skeptical of these interventions. I think I understand Hungary. Denmark is a bit of a puzzle. But this is not breaking news. The breaking news is, as of this morning, a lot of data is in for Canada. And we know that Canada stands with the United Kingdom and the United States and Italy and France as being very favorably disposed toward these tools. The citizens of this nation are very bullish on nudge-type interventions. I can't say that the citizens of Canada are more bullish on these interventions than the citizens of other nations, but I am hopeful that once the full data is in, that might well be the picture. That's the first bit of breaking news. The second bit of breaking news, I think you'll find at least slightly entertaining, which is if people hear that other people like nudge-type interventions, then they like nudge-type interventions more. If you ask people in the abstract, do you like these interventions, you'll get maybe 75% support. If you ask them whether they like it and tell them that there's 75% that support, then it shoots up to 85%. Which is to say that second order or meta nudges, nudges in favor of nudges, are effective. And in producing the data which shows widespread democratic support for nudges, I meant just to learn something, not to generate further support for nudges. But the second bit of breaking news suggests that that will be an effect of the data. The third bit of breaking news is actually occasioned by a conversation I had about an hour ago about cost control in the healthcare sector. And the question is, what tools are available for that? And much of what I'm going to say will bear on that indirectly. Here's something that bears on it, I think, pretty directly. The United Kingdom's behavioral insights team focused in the recent past on the problem of overprescription of antibiotics by doctors, which has multiple adverse consequences. So the tool they chose to try to address that problem is a very small intervention, which is to tell the doctors who they knew are in the upper end of the distribution in terms of antibiotic prescriptions, just to inform them that they are on the upper end of the distribution. They're prescribing more drugs than more antibiotics than their peers. You might think, and as a longtime University of Chicago person, I'm tempted to think, that that's a pitifully ineffective intervention. It will have no consequence. But let's call it that, in quotation marks, sophisticated thought. That's really wrong. The consequence of that little intervention, the letter, was to reduce in a 6-month period prescriptions by 76,000, which is a hint about the power of information about social norms to move behavior. And by the way, that intervention, which saved costs of multiple sorts, was itself very close to costless. Okay, here's some background findings for orientation from Germany. I'm going to tell you about a new German study where people were given information saying you are able to go into green energy if you want. It's a little more expensive. Do you want to sign up? The result of that little intervention was to produce usage of green energy of about 7%. Really modest and kind of puzzlingly modest, given the fact that the citizens of Germany, like the citizens of most similarly situated nations, say they want to use green energy. They don't, low percent. The best predictor of whether people would opt into green energy, and this is not going to win anyone the Nobel Prize, what I'm about to tell you, is whether people are members of the Green Party. That's a true, unsurprising finding. Okay, here's what the researchers did that's a little more amazing. If they told people you are automatically enrolled in green energy, it's a little more expensive, opt out if you wish, there was a 10-fold increase in usage, almost 70% and this is tens of thousands of households, ended up in green energy. So the upshot of this data is that a little shift in the default rule from opt-in to opt-out produced not an incremental change in green energy use. It created a massive change in green energy use, from a tiny minority of participants to a strong majority of participants. Okay, from basically 2008 to the present, we've had a lot of behaviorally informed interventions, and you see the list here. What I want to signal is that many of these have a health dimension. So our greenhouse gas policies, and there's a big tale to be told about that, which have a health dimension, include prominently information to people about the fuel economy or energy efficiency of products. And the record suggests that those are useful interventions. With respect to childhood obesity, our First Lady's interventions, which are behavior change designed to reduce costs as well as to increase longevity and health, they often involve, let's just call it, and I'm going to explain this a little bit more as we continue, choice architecture. That is making sure that the healthy choice is the convenient choice. Okay, here's a little more data on the power of default rules. In the OECD, they did a little experiment. It's small, but I think profound. The experiment was to turn down the default settings on thermostats, not thermometers, on thermostats. I had the wrong word to make sure you're paying attention. Turned down by 1 degree Celsius in winter. The effect of turning down the thermostat by 1 degree was to save significant energy, just changing the default. Now that's consistent with what you heard about green energy. If you turn the thermostat down by default 2 degrees Celsius, what do you think the result would be? The behavioral prediction is, well, then you're going to double the savings. The actual fact is you cut the savings down significantly, which suggests that the consequence of this kind of nudge, that is changing the default, will be significant unless it makes people too cold. And that's a general truth. Okay, in New York, as in many cities, there are default settings for tips where you can automatically give 20, 25, or 30% if you want. What used to be the standard 15, you have to exert a little effort. The effect of that change in the default settings on the screen is to increase tip intake by 10% annually, which means that a cab driver who earns $6,000 in tips a year is suddenly given $600 extra. And the large lesson of these two findings involving thermostats and taxis is that often if the relevant thing is made easy or the path of less resistance, you will get very significant movement in its direction. There's some very old psychology which suggests if people aren't doing something, there are two things you can do to change their failure to do it. One is you can try to figure out what the source of the resistance is and eliminate that. The other is you can give them a kind of push in the direction. You can apply pressure. And the finding is that the application of pressure is typically much less effective than identifying the source of the resistance and taking that away. That's basically what happened in the New York cabs data, in the thermostat data, and in the energy data. Now, there are three big reasons why default rules are a peculiarly effective nudge. One is that inertia has a great deal of force. If the path of doing nothing is the path that is healthy, let's say, or cost-saving, that's the path that people will take. The default rule also has a suggestion in it. It has informational content, and some people are listening, and they will be motivated accordingly. The third reason has to do with something everyone in the room should know about if you don't yet, which is loss aversion. Let's do a little study right now, shall we? This half of the room, you all have to give me, sorry, $10. This was by kind of arrangement with the organizers. I'm very sorry. But I'm not pocketing the $10. The $10 is going to be reallocated so that everyone here on this side, you're going to get $10. This this is actually not true. This is a thought experiment, but I had to phrase it this way so that the psychology would be apparent. If we did this, the aggregate level of well-being in the room would actually go down. It would not be held constant. Those of you who lost $10, and you're not looking at it, you didn't see your faces when I said that. This side of the room was really actually quite unhappy at the prospect. Nice people, but what are you doing here, taking $10 away? Whereas you all were kind of pleased, but it wasn't that big a deal to get $10. People hate losses more than they like corresponding gains. And the default rule establishes what's a gain and what's a loss. It establishes the reference point. Professional golfers putt better for par than for birdie. That's startling because a stroke is a stroke. If a professional golfer on average putted as well for birdie as for par, he'd make $1 million more a year. The problem is when you're putting for birdie, you know if you miss it, you still get a par. You haven't lost anything. If you're putting for par and you miss, you have bogey. That's terrible. And golfers know that. There's loss aversion, and losses are measured by the reference point. The default rule determines that. Okay, here's a little story that's a true story, which is the view of the kind of experts in my country has been that calorie labels are a pretty ineffective health intervention. And the reason is that the aggregate data isn't showing a lot of impact from calorie labels. But if you disaggregate the data, you will find that people who don't have a weight problem are unaffected by calorie labels. That's not sad. They needn't be. They're doing just fine. And the aggregate data masks the fact that people with weight problems actually are losing weight as a result of the calorie labels. Obese men and morbidly obese men are showing a significant reduction in intake as a result of the calorie labels. It's an effective nudge. Obese women are also showing a significant reduction in caloric intake. The one group that isn't is morbidly obese women. That's extremely interesting. It may be that there's some despair that's set in there, but I think that's a very important footnote to the main tale, which is that the story is a success story. Okay, here's an assortment of problems. The one that's maybe most relevant here, the two are smoking and mental illness. Mental illness, by the way, deserves an asterisk because the behavioral science shows of adverse health conditions, there's a lot of adaptation in the human mind. If you lose the use of an arm or a foot, chances are you're just going to be fine in terms of your experience of life. But if you suffer from two things, there's an extreme inability to adapt. One is chronic pain, and the other is mental illness. So these are pressing policy initiatives. On all of these issues, it would be pretty good to use behavioral strategies. Okay, so we have all over the world, some here, of course, in Australia, Mexico, Colombia, Italy, the United States, and the UK, relatively recently in Germany, we have behavioral teams. Here's an executive order which has a charming name from President Obama, 13563. You'll never forget that, will you? As long as you live, it's perfect. It's our constitution for regulation, and there's a provision here which specifically calls out behaviorally informed approaches. You see the words warnings, default rules, and disclosure requirements? Those are nudges. This one from more recently is more targeted to behavioral science. It's less constitution-like, it's narrower, but it is a strong signal from our president, use behavioral science, basically. Okay, so the question is what happened? And I'm now going to give you a bit of a glimpse. I taught at the University of Chicago, as you know, for many years, and when we woke up in the morning, we had a little prayer that we would say. It wasn't really to God so much as to, I think, the Nobel Prize people in Sweden. And the prayer went like this: human beings are rational, they calculate probabilities and maximize expected value, they respond to incentives. Amen. And the policy prescription that follows is improve incentives. And certainly governments that I'm familiar with know this prayer. Okay, so the behavioral objections, all of which relate to healthcare, I think the principal ones are, it's just 5. Human beings have limited attention, that there are aspects of products and activities and situations that just aren't on their view screen. So if you're buying, let's say, a meal at a great restaurant, the fact that it has high calories may not be very much what you're thinking about. If you're engaging with the healthcare system because you need some sort of attention, the fact that you've gone to the emergency room when you really don't have to, and that's costly for the system, that might not be what you're focused on. We see, and actually this is a literal truth, we see a very small subset of the things that are actually before our eyes, and that means that many of the things that could help us or hurt us are not motivating our behavior. Human beings often think that the future is a foreign country, later land, and they're not sure they're ever going to visit. And I have a little demonstration right now of present bias. Think, if you would, of yourself on a beach, your favorite beach that you've ever visited, tomorrow. Most of you just did it. A fifth of you didn't. Now everyone's done it. Okay, here's what we know from that there's actually an identifiable part of the brain that lit up. Call it the narcissistic part of the brain. It's the part of the brain that lights up not when you're thinking about beaches, but when you're thinking about yourself. And that just happened. Now think about yourself, if you would, on the same beach in 2018. For a significant percentage of the population, once they think about themselves on a beach in 2018, that part of the brain doesn't light up. Their future self is to them a stranger, neurologically. Now the kicker is, for the part of the population for whom that part of the brain doesn't light up, they would rather have $5 today than $10 next week. The future for them is a matter of relative indifference. And even for those who don't show present bias in the neurological sense, there's a pervasive human tendency to focus on the short term. We know that people don't always deal well with probability. In New York, not long ago, people were very frightened of Ebola. Do you know who the Kardashians are, the TV stars? Okay, I don't know that they were frightened about Ebola, but what I do know is at the time when many New Yorkers were frightened of Ebola, more Americans had married Kardashians than had died of Ebola. And people were not thinking, oh my gosh, I might find myself marrying a Kardashian. Now the upshot of the Ebola scare is that an old behavioral finding, which is people make judgments about risk by thinking, does an event come readily to mind? That was working with a vengeance. People had a salient event where someone got Ebola in the United States, one person had died. And that drove probability judgments through the roof, even though the statistical reality was very low. And the fact of the availability bias, as it's called, can lead to underestimation of some health risks and exaggerated sense of others, and that can affect the healthcare system in very unfortunate ways. We know that people are, other things being equal, unrealistically optimistic. 90% of drivers believe that they're better than the average driver and less likely to be involved in a serious accident. 94% of university professors believe that they are better than the average university professor. Something like 100% of people think their senses of humor is better than average. If you have a couple and ask each member what percentage of the household labor do you do, and add up the two numbers, if it isn't over 100%, you have a very unusual couple. Unrealistic optimism can lead people, I understand the word baby boomers was used a lot earlier here. It can lead boomers to fail to take steps that can be very important so that they impose less costs on themselves and on the healthcare system. We also know that people's brains fire when they see losses. They're going to miss the power putt, The brains are much less activated when they are told they're going to miss the birdie putt. And whether something is described as a loss or a gain, really it depends on communication. If you say you will save $200 next year if you use energy conservation, people aren't too interested in that. If people are told you're going to lose $200 next year if you don't use energy conservation, people are pretty interested in that. And that has implications for the healthcare system. Okay, so here are 6 behavioral policy claims. Default rules really matter. You saw some examples. Incentives may not matter much because they may not be salient to people, and they may involve 5 years from now. Choice architecture, understood as the background against which people make decisions, is not avoidable, and it can be exceedingly important. Here's a little data that startles me. If people sign a form at the beginning, they're more likely to be honest than if they sign a form at the end. There's evidence suggesting that if a government wants to save significant money by combating fraud or misstatement, it would do well to move from end of the form signature to front of the form signature. There's also data suggesting that people who are concerned about health and the environment will be more likely to buy a candy bar if it's in a green wrapper, even if it's entirely milk chocolate, because green automatically signals health. And a candy bar has to have, I think, a wrapper around it, I hope, just as a form has to have a place where you sign. And this isn't avoidable, and it has a big impact on what ultimately happens. Okay, simplicity is very important, and people can use a nudge. I'm going to say a little bit about what that means. With respect to simplicity, the United Kingdom's Behavioral Insights team has a mantra, which is called "Make it easy." And that is, I think, misleadingly banal. Misleadingly meaning it's much less banal than it seems, and I'll give a few examples. Okay, so here's some data about automatic enrollment and savings plans, and take this as pretty vivid real-world evidence of not an incremental effect, but a kind of massive effect from a switch of the sort we're describing. And I hope that you can think about contexts where a default can be rejiggered or something can just be described as the social norm in a way that can produce a policy goal. So what you're observing is the effect of automatic enrollment on savings plans in the United States. And what you're seeing is that at every end of the income distribution, participation in plans is shooting up significantly as a result of what, according to a Nobel Prize-winning theorem, should have no effect at all. So the Nobel Prize-winning theorem says that if the default rule goes one way or the other, and people can costlessly switch, it will have no impact on the outcome. But the data shows that's not true. If people are defaulted into savings, they are going to participate big time. If they have to opt in, the participation rate is going to be a lot lower. This is like the German data on green energy, but it's a much larger data set. Okay, this is, I think, at least with respect to government agencies that I'm familiar with, this is a picture of government failure. And what you're seeing here is a flow chart for a form we have for financial aid for poor students who want to go to college. I don't have enough slides to put the form up. It would be well over 100, so I am, being merciful on you and myself by just showing you the flow chart. Now, no one wanted the form to be difficult and so challenging for students as to defeat the purposes of the subsidy, but that's what's happened. And time and again, I saw in our government the equivalent of this, where complexity sometimes generated by lawyers, sometimes generated by well-meaning people wanting to clarify things, ended up being a counterproductive nudge. Okay, so if you want a definition of a nudge that has an example in it, think of a GPS device as the thing. And the reason the GPS device is defining is that it helps people get in the direction they want to go in a way that's respectful of their preferred destination, that preserves their freedom of choice, but tells them, you know, this is what you should do. If you think I want the scenic route rather than the short route, or I have some nostalgia for a particular path, you can completely do that. But it increases life's navigability. So our book, Nudge, doesn't use the word navigability. It's a kind of unwieldy word, but I'm increasingly thinking that in the areas of health and finance, navigability is really what's needed, isn't it? If you think about a hospital or a doctor or a nurse or a patient or someone maybe going to the emergency room or not, the challenge is that navigability isn't there. Okay. This is my only scandalous slide. It's a urinal. It's not just any urinal. Some of the women in the room maybe have never seen a urinal before. This is actually what it looks like. This is a urinal that has a fly painted on it. The result of painting the fly on the urinal was to reduce spillage in the Netherlands airport by 44%. Don't ask me how they know that. What makes the example instructive, it's resolving an admittedly modest public health problem, but what makes it instructive is that it's paying attention to salience. It makes location, so to speak, salient, and that can help. Okay, here's this is an actual postcard someone sent me from Germany. I can't read German either, but I think I know what this says. Okay, here's something like the UK antibiotic study. It just says, take your litter home, other people do. And we know the impact of that can be very significant. In the UK, an original nudge that Prime Minister Cameron introduced was to try to reduce delinquent tax paying, and I'm hoping you're thinking of analogs, just by sending a letter to the delinquent taxpayers saying you're in a small group in your community, haven't paid your taxes on time. Would you like to pay your taxes? And the consequence was to produce a lot of money flowing into the UK Treasury. Other interventions in other nations, including saying, you know, there are great public services that are made possible, don't you want to pay up? No impact. Telling people you might get in trouble if you don't pay, that didn't have much of an impact either. It's invoking the social norm that ended up having an effect. Okay, this is sometimes described as a nudge cafeteria. The idea is to make food, healthy foods, the salient foods, the ones that you can see easily. And our Department of Agriculture has found that of the universe of interventions designed to discourage obesity and encourage healthy eating, this one is one of the relatively few that has kind of fabulous evidence base behind it. Okay, so what we're talking about is a feature of the social environment that affects choices without imposing coercion or any kind of material incentive. The fact that citizens in the United States and Germany, two nations that might be thought to be kind of scared of coercive interventions, the fact that they are so upbeat about these interventions, I think is a product of the fact that we aren't speaking about coercion or taxes or incentives of that kind. Okay, it's possible to think of approaches that go well beyond nudges that are also behaviorally informed. And I hope you're going to be thinking of healthcare analogs that are not, strictly speaking, choice preserving, but that are on balance justified. And I'm going to give you an example that has health features, but that is a different domain, and that is energy efficiency and fuel economy rules. I'm going to tell you some facts, and then I'm going to tell you a secret. Okay, the facts are that the United States has had a kind of quiet revolution with respect to greenhouse gas emissions, air pollution, and consumer savings, because our appliances are much more energy efficient, and so are our automobiles. The effect of what you're seeing in this slide is actually equivalent to the effect that we would have obtained if our Congress had enacted a big greenhouse gas law. This is all done by the executive branch pursuant to laws that weren't meant to focus on greenhouse gases. They're about fuel economy and energy efficiency, but very big savings. Okay, that's all widely known. What's secret, not in the sense that it's hidden, but that it's not widely known, is that the bulk of the savings from these regulations are consumers are saving a ton of money. They have cars and appliances that just cost much less to operate. Now, at first glance, that seems wonderful, but they could have bought those cars and appliances without a government regulation. They were available. So on standard economic assumptions, those savings actually shouldn't count. See the point? If Americans wanted to buy an energy-efficient refrigerator, there wasn't anything stopping them. If they wanted to get a hybrid vehicle, that's the easiest thing in the world to find, but they're not buying them, which creates a real challenge for government, which is to explain why it is counting those consumer savings, which consumers seem pretty uninterested in. And there are plenty of healthcare analogs. The government's response to the standard economic objection, which is basically, what are you doing here? Giving consumers products they're not interested in, is behavioral. It's consumers, when they're buying a refrigerator, are thinking, how much does it cost? Does it work? How does it look? And how big is it? That's the 4 questions. The question, how much is it going to cost me over the next 12 years to run? That's not much of a question. That's like, forgive the word, a urinal without a fly. The first argument is that people are just not attending to that. And the second is they're thinking about how much is it going to cost and what's it going to be like today. They're not thinking, am I going to save money over the next decade? So there's an argument about attention and an argument about present bias that are both on the surface of this behaviorally informed but not nudgy intervention. It's much more aggressive. Okay, for orientation, here are 5 interventions, and the one I want to put an asterisk next to is reminders. This is the sleeper nudge, which in the healthcare domain, I'm sure you're seeing this, a simple text message or a communication that goes to patients or doctors can have a much larger impact than one would have anticipated. And the reason is the thing people are being reminded of is something they definitely care about, but they don't attend to unless they get the reminder. The reminder is like the painted fly. Here are 5 more, and the one I want to put an asterisk next to on this one is active choosing. This is the sleeper nudge of this set. Okay, can I just ask you, how many people in this room are planning to buy a new car in 2017? Okay, it's overwhelmingly likely that the number of cars bought by the people in this room, or the number of people in this room who are buying cars, just increased. And the reason is, if you ask a large group of people, how many of you are going to do X next year, the number of people who do X next year grows because it brings it to the surface of the mind. I wasn't planning to, but I know I'm buying a car next year. Okay, the simple point is if you actively make a hospital or a doctor or a patient choose something, you bring it to the surface of the mind, and that often has a significant effect on behavior. Okay, so these things aren't nudges. Subsidies, tax incentives, civil penalties, and criminal sentences. These things may be important. They're certainly part of the toolbox, but they are a different category. Okay, I'm going to give you 2 examples from recent US policy. We had a problem, which is that students are eligible, poor students are eligible for free school meals in public schools. And this is kind of a searing problem, meaning that these are kids who may have obesity or health problems, may have hunger issues, and they are eligible for nutritious, relatively low-calorie, good meals at their schools, and they're not signing up. It's unclear why they're not signing up. It might be the parents are frightened by a message from the government. It might be it's just too complicated to sign up. So there was an initiative called direct certification, it's very much in place, which says you're automatically in if we know you're poor. If you don't want to participate, you don't have to, but you're automatically in. The consequence is 12 million children, basically in recent years, are getting school meals that are nutritious and healthful. And while that's an abstract number, this is the one nudge, I confess, that I get a little emotional about. If you could see, half of those 12 million kids marching outside this building, it would be pretty overwhelming and inspiring. Okay, here's a slogan, plate, not pyramid. This was my slogan in government. It's not the most likely slogan, but this is my slogan. Here is the old US Department of Agriculture food pyramid designed to encourage healthy choices. And again, I'm hoping you're thinking of plenty of analogs. There's a person, gender unclear, evidently shoeless, marching to the top of a pyramid. Suppose that you are a parent or a teacher or a nurse or a teenager trying to figure out what you should eat based on this. First question I would think is, what are you marching toward? What is that white triangle? Is that thinness? Is it death? Second question is, what are those stripes connoting? There's green, there's red, there's reddish, there's blue. Can you map those colors onto food groups? I kind of do this stuff and I can't. Do you recognize the foods? Can you see what those foods are at the bottom? There's only one that's clearly recognizable. Isn't there on the bottom right? That's a shoe. Is the US government telling people, please eat your shoe? Okay, so we got rid of that and did this. It's the new Department of Agriculture food plate, and it says make half your plate fruits and vegetables. It's basically what it says. And the idea is that the failure of the food pyramid is a product not of people's resistance to the message. It's that they don't understand what they're supposed to do. And often I found in my own government experience, this is maybe lesson number one, that people's non-response to a healthcare, financial, and environmental guide or direction was a response not of disagreement, but of incomprehension. And because the people who devised the thing are experts, they have no sense that incomprehension is even possible. But there's the pyramid. So the slogan, plate, not pyramid. Okay, if there's one slide you remember, I hope it's this one. In Denmark, automatic enrollment in defiance of the prayer has a much bigger effect than significant tax incentives in producing savings. So the costly intervention, that is a tax incentive, a very modest effect in increasing savings. The cheap intervention, automatic enrollment, a very large impact. A little company called O-Power sends people a home energy report, which tells people how their energy use compares to that of their peers. It's like the slide from the UK. The effect is equivalent to that of an 8 to 20% spike in the short-term cost of electricity. Either tax people's electricity use significantly or send them a little note comparing their energy use to that of their peers. The second, which is costless, has the same effect. Remember the flow chart for the financial aid form? Simplifying the form has an impact equivalent to increasing the subsidy by a couple $1,000s. So if you increase the subsidy, you will indeed get a significant boost in college attendance, but not higher than if you simplify the form. Okay, here are just a few examples from the White House's Social and Behavioral Sciences team. An email campaign to inform members of our military about how to increase savings doubled enrollment. A little text message reminding lower-income students to complete pre-matriculation tasks increased college enrollment by 5.7 percentage points. Now, not by 5.7%, which would be significant but not huge, 5.7 percentage points. If you can do that with doctor behavior, patient behavior in a way that's imposing costs or adverse health outcomes, that would be probably a lifesaver. A little letter to farmers designed to tell them that loans are available produced a 22% increase, not in the proportion of farmers who applied for loans, but of those who actually got the loans. A new signature box on an online form, and this is like sign early, no sign at the end, produced in just 1 quarter an additional $1.5 million in fees. Okay, I think I'm going to just come close to closing here by noting that in some cases, stronger tools are better. So whether it's the United States or Canada or Australia or Germany, there's definitely a place for economic incentives and mandates. But often you have a lot of heterogeneity with respect to doctors and hospitals and nurses and patients. Government and business doesn't know best. There's a risk that some actors are going to have their own agenda. And we should see freedom of choice not only as an important safeguard against error on the part of the choice architects, but also as an ingredient in people's welfare and a way that people who interact with fellow members of the human species respect their dignity. Okay, here's some wise words from a great Irish poet, which is my final nudge for you. Please don't wait to strike till the iron is hot, but make it hot by striking. Thanks.
For you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Sunstein, for that extraordinary tour d'horizon of your work on nudging. I didn't like it. Who here liked that talk? That's the only thing I have to say.
Good.
I want to begin by repeating a question I asked you just before lunch, which is, when you talk about these sophisticated changes at the margin to government action, do you sometimes have the feeling these days that you're operating in some weird pre-November 8th world and that the Trump wave has just swept that all away?
It's a great question and a natural question. So I think let's distinguish between the world and the United States, shall we? In countries all over the world, there's not just an increase in use of behaviorally informed tools, there's a kind of massive surge of interest. So Qatar recently announced it's creating a behavioral insights team. There's activity in France and Italy, as well as established institutions all over. So I think of behavioral science in terms of public policy. It's out of its childhood, but it's not quite reached puberty. It's around 11 or 12 in terms of development, and we're going to see a ton over the next generation. In the United States, the use of behaviorally informed tools is so ingrained in the day-to-day work of, our Department of Health and Human Services, our Environmental Protection Agency, our Department of Transportation, our Social Security Administration, that it's not created a Republican and Democratic division, so that I just don't expect that there's going to be any diminution in the enthusiasm. You didn't see in it, you saw in the debates and in the statements of the president-elect a lot of words, but I don't think he ever said, I'm going to excise behavioral science from the United States government. That would have been a very surprising thing for him to say for numerous reasons. For one thing, he's a fantastic practitioner of behavioral science. He's fantastic, whether you like him or not. He has a lot of intuitive appreciation. So he says, everyone's voting for me. Or the X, and the X will be some group, they love me. And that's exactly what he should be saying if he wants to encourage, and he succeeded. That was one of his tools. So in terms of the health policies, finance stuff, the Affordable Care Act is highly unlikely to survive in its current form, but the most controversial aspects of the Affordable Care Act are not the things that we're talking about. The things that our nudge is in the Affordable Care Act are disclosure policies so as to encourage hospitals to compete with one another on dimension of performance and cost. That's both, helping patients and helping the system. And that's not something that Republicans oppose.
Pinning down the ideology of the president-elect can be a difficult task. So let's back away from that and talk about the reaction to your book when it came out among people who know they're movement conservatives. I was struck by the plaudits that came out from folks like George Will, because perhaps mistakenly, my assumption would have been that this would have, your thoughts, your observations would have been perceived as more nanny state government, the government coming out and saying, well, why don't you just, or here, I'll sign you up for, or, and yet a lot of conservative commentators got the fact that this represents a substantial ratcheting down in coercion in government.
Well, if you have a situation in which the government isn't doing anything, let's say you have a government that hasn't come to terms at all with the tobacco problem, and then it's suggested we should have first public education, second graphic health warnings, and third, let's say, as some countries have explored, plain packages. That seems like an increase in government activity relative to the status quo, but it's something that conservatives generally find, let's say, somewhere between fine and only minimally concerning. So one of the first calls I got was from the Weekly Standard, which is one of our conservative magazines. They said, we really quite like this. Will you come in and talk to us? And when I was working at our White House, actually, I got calls from Republicans saying, we like your ideas. Can you work with us on a competing healthcare bill? I couldn't say, yes, I'd love to do that. But it was an interesting fact that that was what the Republicans thought. So consistent with your point, insofar as we're adding choice-preserving tools where we had nothing, it can be congenial to a conservative program, or at least not very disturbing. If the idea is that we're going to reduce mandates and substitute for mandates or taxes something more like information or default rule, that's great. Then it's a reduction in government activity. What I found in my own interactions with Republicans in our government is that at least when they weren't running for re-election, they're impressively pragmatic. So with a strong, and I know this is true here too, that a number of Canadians, the paternalism doesn't have quite the pejorative quality here that it does in the United States, but a number of Canadians, consistent with our data, want freedom of choice to be preserved. And this is a way of doing that. If you have something that says, you can't buy certain kinds of refrigerators because they're not energy efficient, and the reason is that consumers are making the wrong choices, that's another thing. And we can think of healthcare areas where to tell doctors or hospitals, this is what you must do, seems, who do you think you are to do that? And you don't have to be any political persuasion to agree with that, but to inform people that you're costing the healthcare system a lot, or this behavior, which 10% of people are doing, is harmful, let's say, to the efforts for cost containment from which we all benefit, that's not something that's going to split people along ideological lines.
You also mentioned before lunch that your conversations with the Canadian government about nudges pretty substantially predate the election of the Trudeau Liberals last fall, which could, it could suggest on the one hand, that your ideas are congenial to conservatives, and on the other hand, to the extent that you were talking to government departments rather than to elected officials, that governments operate at various levels, and that the work you're talking about will proceed under a Trump administration, no matter what.
Yes, I'll tell you one thing that I think is helpful. If you think to yourself, I'm a conservative, therefore I think this, or I'm a liberal or a progressive, therefore I think that, to cease having those thoughts and to think instead, you know, that with respect to, let's say, children in some nations, there's a childhood obesity problem. And the question is, what's the best way of addressing that? And whether you are left of center or right of center, chances are you're not going to say we should ban brownies. Brownies, that's not a good, right? That wouldn't be a good idea. Or we should have a stiff tax on certain products. On reasonable assumptions, you know, a stiff tax at least, that's not a good idea. But to say, look, are there things we can do in the healthcare system so as to make it easier so that parents have something like a GPS and hospitals can work with them? That's not something where the left and the right would divide necessarily. And if you start by saying, you know, I voted for X, rather than how do we address childhood obesity? You see the direction I'm going? That I felt, even in the White House working for a Democratic president, if I had thought to myself in my job, I'm a Democrat, and as a Democrat I think this, I think that I would have done my job worse. Instead thinking, you know, you're here to serve the American people, and there's a problem people face. They aren't saving enough for retirement. What is an effective way of doing that? That doesn't mean that people are going to have money when they're 80, but not when they're 30. That wouldn't be very helpful.
That gets to something we've often seen, those of us who follow politics a lot, where elected officials will take first steps towards an interesting new idea until they're reminded by their colleagues that that's not the sort of thing that people like them are for. And then they back away from it. And on that note, let's take a bit of a detour into some other recent writing you've done on the way that polarized debates become more polarized, because I find that fascinating. You suggested in some recent articles around the election that if you put biased, objective information of the kind that is so often produced in the Toronto Star in front of voters who already know where they stand on a contentious point of debate, it tends to drive them further apart. How does that work?
So let me give you the data, and I'm hoping you're going to think in your area where this creates an opportunity and where it creates a challenge. So let's do a little experiment. Everyone think to yourself, if you would, you don't have to write it down, how good looking do you think you are on a scale of 1 to 10? Okay, now imagine you learn from someone who's objective that actually you lowballed your looks. You're better looking than you think you are. The data suggests that once people receive that objective information, they're better looking than they think they are, from a credible source, they update. They go, oh, I'm an 8, not a 6, completely. Now assume that you learn from an objective source, maybe the Toronto Star, that you're actually a little less good looking than you think you are, according to a credible source. People don't update. And the evidence is that what's true for looks is true for basically everything under the sun. What's the risk that you're going to have a bad health condition in 10 years? What's the risk that you're going to have a falling out with your partner? What's the risk that there are going to be rodents in your home? For all of these and the 24 more, there's an asymmetry where good news matters more to people than bad news. And that actually has neurological foundations. The brain incorporates good information, happy-making information more than bad news. Okay, here's the political analog. I'll give you my data. which is I sorted Americans after a survey into three groups: those who think that climate change is not a big deal, those who are in the middle, and those who think it's a very big deal. Basically, strong believers, moderates, and weak believers. And the weak believers aren't denialists. They just think warming is likely to be 3.5 degrees F by 2100, and they are not that excited about the Paris Agreement. They're the bottom third, but not the climate change is a hoax. And the big believers, they think that warming is likely to be about 60.3 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, then I gave half of that very large group information suggesting that actually it's going to get much hotter according to recent science than people anticipated. It might be as high as 11 degrees by 2100. Okay, and I gave half of the group information saying that it's actually not that big a problem. Scientists think it's going to be 1 to 5 degrees. Now what do you think? Okay, the weak believers were very responsive to the good news that it's only going to be 1 to 5. They went down a full degree from 3.5 to 2.5. They're very responsive. It's like hearing they're better looking than they thought. The weak believers were completely unresponsive to the bad news. At 3.5, just in the abstract, that's where they were. When they heard scientists think it's going to go up to 11, they were unmoved entirely. They stuck at 3.5 on average. Okay, that's politically, I think, kind of dynamite, suggesting that across a wide range of issues in their health analogs, people are impervious to bad news, and they are very responsive to good news. I don't think that's intellectually that interesting, because it's just replicating the finding I've told you about. Here's the intellectually interesting one. This is the one I hope to get. If climate change believers are told that we're all going to burn up, they think we're all going to burn up. They go up 2 degrees from 6.3 to 8.3. If they're told actually it's not going to be so bad, they're only modestly affected. They go down by less than a degree. That's to suggest that climate change believers are very responsive to it's horrible and quite unresponsive to don't worry so much. Now we get to politics. This little experiment I just told you about, it's happening every day on the social media. People are given news saying the climate change, it's not so bad, it's getting terrible. And the people who are the big believers are getting more polarized, oh my God. And the people who are relatively skeptical are getting more polarized, don't worry. There's a group in the middle, I haven't told you about the moderates, who were responsive equally to the good news and bad news. They showed no asymmetry. But that's the middle group. And I'm now trying to figure this out with lots and lots of different issues, immigration and healthcare issues and gun control issues. What we're seeing is the good news effect, like for looks, that is pervasive. People regularly update when they hear things are better than they thought. We're also getting suggestive, I don't have the nail in the coffin yet on this one, as I do for climate, but suggestive when people are really invested in thinking things are terrible, they are highly resistant to corrective news thinking it's not so bad, because their investment is such that they'd rather think they're right than to think that the world's going to survive.
And another thing you add, which strikes me in some of the debates that I've covered, is you ask, what is it that will get someone to change their mind in a surprising way? What will get a real climate change skeptic to decide that it is a bad deal? And that's when when it is a serious danger. And you came up with the notion of surprising validators. What's that?
Okay, so if you get someone who used to be a participant in terrorist activity or drawn to it, saying to people who are deciding whether to join a terrorist cause, I was drawn to this like you, or actually was involved, and it was the biggest mistake of my life. Or if you have someone who was a drug abuser talking to a group of, let's say, 19-year-olds who have drug issues, saying this, I almost died, get out of this while you can, that's a surprising validator. It's not like some authority figure it's not like the US government or some health official saying one of the two things. It's someone who's like you. And that can have a meaningful effect on activity. In the healthcare area, I think this has yet to be sufficiently exploited, where if you have a participant either in the healthcare system or a patient speaking to the relevant population, it's like they're amplifiers on their voice rather than silencers on their voice. So that's one thing. Also in the context of climate, and this is generalizable too, it's not about surprising validators. It's kind of appealing to people's understanding of their identity. So if you tell people who think we shouldn't do anything about climate change, you know, the best response, you tell them this: experts believe that the best response to the problem of climate change is to have greater reliance on nuclear power. Then they're more likely to believe in climate change. Even though reliance on nuclear power doesn't mean climate change is more likely. It's because the remedy doesn't seem like solar, which makes climate change skeptics roll their eyes. It seems kind of tough. Nuclear, which is to suggest that if the remedy for the thing, I'm hoping your minds are going in directions because of your own expertise that I couldn't think of, where you get people's remedy for the problem being one that makes them excited rather than, oh, now I have to do something.
So if we argued that the best way to combat climate change was to have a lot more hunting, then people would go, you know, excellent, yeah.
You get an increase on the part of at least a subpopulation of skeptics.
The surprising validator thing strikes me in the context of a major Canadian debate, the sovereignty debate over whether Quebec should secede, where the biggest collapse in support for Quebec staying in Canada was 20 years ago when Brian Mulroney, the Prime Minister of the country, Robert Bourassa, the notionally pro-Canadian Premier of Quebec, both said, well, the country's not worth it. The country's a mess. No wonder Quebecers want to secede. Support for secession just went up like that. And on another debate, during the presidential election, the worst week that Trump had was after the audio tapes came out in which he seemed to be bragging about sexual assault. And a lot of conservative Republicans said, I can't defend this guy. John McCain, Reince Priebus said, this is indefensible. And then support for Trump took a nasty dip. When they stopped saying that, it didn't matter how much liberals said that it was awful. What you needed was somebody from Trump's own camp saying that they'd given up on Trump.
Right. So governments have typically policy-making offices and legislative affairs offices and communications offices. And at least some governments with which I'm familiar, the legislative affairs and communications offices are very alert to the importance of validators. I think that's one of the ugliest words in the English language in kind of 10 ways. It ranks with deliverable. Do you have the word deliverable here? It's outdone by one, so to speak, by one word, which, do you have the word do out? After a meeting in our government, someone say, can we make a list of the do outs? That's really bad. That's the champion bad word. But the word validators is a bad word, but it's an important concept. And to have a kind of intuitive workaday awareness that if you get someone who you don't expect to say the relevant thing, then it just has credibility.
Yeah, and I've had many friends who work in government communications whose job is to go out and line up all of those. Those of you who work on Parliament Hill, let's decide right here and now that we're not going to take do out back to work.
That is a do out.
Every time I try to get out, they suck me back in. Back to nudges in healthcare. Something that you mentioned earlier in our conversation here. I wonder what you thought of Michael Bloomberg's attempt when he was the mayor of New York City to impose substantial taxes on sugary soft drinks.
I didn't know that was his policy, actually, but the data seemed to me to drive any conclusion, and my view on the data is kind of cautiously positive, but agnosticism. The reason for cautious optimism is my understanding of recent data is that soda taxes have a positive effect in reducing things that are associated with adverse health outcomes. My understanding is that in the UK, the introduction of a soda tax, I guess it is having, even before it goes into effect, proliferating effects that look positive. The harm of any kind of tax is, first, that it discourages people from getting a product they enjoy, and second, that it's regressive. So it has an adverse effect on a set of the population that probably doesn't deserve that. But for cigarettes, neither of those is a convincing objection, because the regressivity is actually a positive for the population. That is, they pay more taxes and they get sick less. So they are disproportionate beneficiaries. And the fact that it is discouraging purchase of the product, it does inflict a cost that people can't get cigarettes or, let's say, high-calorie soda with the ease that they could before. But in the long run, they can get it if the tax isn't that stiff, and it's arguably in their interest. So I think everything depends on what is the incidence of the health benefits. Is it significant, and who's getting them? And are we observing significant social costs? What do they look like? So cautious optimism.
Perhaps we'll close on this. I was struck by as everyone was, by the difference between the food pyramid and a plate that looks like what people actually eat. It seems to me to suggest, among many other things, that one thing we could stand to do is to broaden the diversity, defined many different ways, of the number of the kind of people we bring into government. That seems to me that a problem of long standing that could only be fixed by a graphic designer. Do we have too many health policy experts in health policy?
You know, I learned there's a word that's like somewhere between appreciation and reverence. That's what I learned to have for the health policy experts, closer to the reverence end. So we had some doctors in our government who were not only practicing physicians, which is so important for health policy, but also just new health policy. And they weren't that diverse along the dimension of their background, and that wasn't a problem. So health policy, if health policy experts don't know what it's like for actual people to deal with the health policy system, then then their expertise has a gap in it. But I would want maybe to infuse the system with an appreciation of behavioral biases and human fallibility, absolutely, and see that as maybe part of health policy rather than as a fewer of those people.
Very good. Cass Sunstein, thanks very much for taking the time to talk to us, and I hope we'll see you many more times in the future.